So my name is Joanna Gao, and I am the tech lead on the FT's Visual and Data Journalism team. And this is a presentation that I prepared alongside Susan McGregor, who is a co-chair of the Center for Data, Media, and Society at Columbia University's Data Science Institute. And she was also previously a senior programmer for the Wall Street Journal's news graphics team. Susan's internet connection isn't super stable today, so I'm going to be presenting our work, but she's going to try to connect for the Q&A later, so hopefully that will work out in a bit. But we're really excited to be part of this event with you all, where we get to a chance to reflect on the last couple of years. It's been so fascinating to hear everything that everyone's presented so far this morning, and I'm really looking forward to having more conversations later in the Q&A. But I feel like with things that we've heard today, we've really, the pandemic has really brought data to the forefront. And it's also exposed some of these systemic problems that we've had for years around handling data in the newsroom. And many of these issues aren't about technology, they're not about technical skills, but they're actually around culture, around data, how it fits into newsroom strategy and people management. And so though Susan and I both come from technical backgrounds, we're actually going to focus our presentation on the cultural and management side of data handling and building a data culture in the newsroom. So we're going to pull a couple of examples from our own experiences, but we've also spoken to a few other news organizations for this presentation. And what we're hoping is that this will get to start a discussion about how we take some of these lessons forward. And we're really excited to hear from you about what you think about these topics as well. We certainly don't want the conversation to end here. So first, to set the scene, the newsroom is really, really good at managing some things. The nature of the news business is chaotic, as you probably know, and managing that chaos is really a skill. It's a business that thrives on flexibility and the ability to pivot at a moment's notice. And as a result, it's really good at certain types of stories. And when it comes to data, certain kinds of data stories. Newsrooms have always been really good at the kind of short-term, quick, newsy data stories. For example, if a stock index hits a new low, and partially that's because there are numbers that are generated, compiled, and contextualized already externally. Newsrooms are also really good at data that's narrowly focused. Just a couple of examples off the top of my mind. We've seen some really great projects from newsrooms compiling data on wildfires, people facing the death penalty, or mass shootings. And finally, we've also seen some really successful complex data investigations where we get a small number of reporters working closely together. And that's just because it's easier for a small project-based group to communicate with each other about data. However, with the pandemic, we really saw a totally different kind of situation. We didn't have external data sources that could give us numbers, and more importantly, their context around those numbers for these kind of short-term, quick newsy stories that we're used to. The data set also wasn't very narrow. It touched every desk, every area of coverage in the newsroom, and information often needed to be joined together and built off of other reporters. And finally, there weren't just a few users. There were many reporters around the newsroom across many beats who needed to be on the same page with these numbers. And this kind of data needed a totally different management strategy. So under typical management structures and initiatives, managing pandemic-like data, which is long-term, sprawling, over many users, isn't really adequate. And if it's not managed correctly, there can be consequences both internally and also externally. So first, externally, readers demand data, and the trust that readers have for your publication could be damaged if there are inconsistencies or perceived inconsistencies beyond across different stories and desks. And I say the word perceived inconsistencies because in a lot of these cases, there are a lot of different numbers, not because one or the other is wrong or people can't read, but because there's a different way of counting. So for example, in the US, if you're looking at unemployment numbers, there are quite a few different metrics for it. There isn't just one right answer, which is why they release so many different numbers. But when we reported on it, it's really useful to be able to contextualize the numbers so it's obvious why there's a difference, if there is supposed to be a difference across different stories. Secondly, there could be missed story opportunities. COVID isn't the only long haul story out there that intersects lots of different topics. For example, as you probably all know, data from the Panama Papers or something maybe very current that we're probably all working on right now, looking at the cost of living crisis and inflation hitting many countries across the world. Thirdly, there's a risk for duplicated effort. When there isn't good communication across a newsroom about what data is being collected and analyzed and defined, you can often find multiple people doing the exact same tasks. And while it's really great to have people replicate your data work to check for its accuracy, it's not really great if both efforts are being done in a vacuum. And finally, these three things can lead to burnout and demoralize staff. It can reduce people's motivation and increase stress and frustration. In the Reuters Institute's Changing Newsrooms report, they found that the biggest concerns from publishers was around the lack of skills to deliver innovative solutions. So we know that newsrooms definitely don't want more burnout and demoralization if they can help it. What makes this all really difficult isn't just a technical problem. If anything, it's much more of a management and culture problem, and that's what we're going to focus on today. We focused on 4 areas, and we kind of felt like everyone really likes a good acronym. We went through a couple options, but this is the one we settled on. AIMS, A-I-M and S. A for attitudes in the newsroom, I for incentive structures, M for the money factor, and S for how to sustain that change. So first, A, for attitudes. If there isn't enough buy-in among leadership that data is important and that there is value in cultivating quality data, it could be a real uphill battle. Using data in reporting hasn't really been a new thing, but certainly it's become much more important as technology has made it easier to collect and distribute information. Audiences want it now more than ever and expect it because they live in these data-saturated environments. So data needs to be treated as a tangible asset that can drive stories and not just be something that's an on-demand add-on at the end. There also needs to be the recognition that data journalism isn't just a singular beat, but it's also a type of reporting. This is wording that we're lifting from Aaron Williams, who was a former Washington Post data and graphics reporter that he wrote in a source post when he left the newsroom for Netflix. And the key to this is just because it's not another type of reporting, this attitude of thinking of data as a valuable asset can't just be accepted or seen as a responsibility of just one particular desk. But this is an attitude that needs to be understood across the entire newsroom. But how do you actually change attitudes? So I've put a diagram on the right, and it's an 8-step framework for leading change by John Cotter, who is a professor from Harvard Business School. It's a model that we really like, and we've mapped the model to some advice more specific to newsrooms. This is going to be just a very, very quick whistle-stop tour just because of the time, but we're always happy to chat more about this later. The first step in this model is to create a sense of urgency. When it comes to viewing the importance of long-haul data, highlighting the risk of not doing it is what can help create a sense of urgency. The risks of losing the trust of our readers or the cost of duplicated work and lost story opportunities. These are risks that will motivate newsroom editors really quickly. The next few steps I'm just going to breeze right through are about finding champions for your initiative in your organization and finding out how to connect these changes to your company's goals. You want to make sure that you've got consistent messaging across your ambassadors. And also the important thing is to not ignore the resistance to the change. You want to get to know the resistors, even though sometimes it's difficult to do so. You want to get to know what the motivations that they have are and to use that to figure out how to get them onto your side. The 6th step is to generate short-term wins. This is really about being your own PR team in your own newsroom and shouting about your wins. So for example, did you get a scoop? Was there a news story that you couldn't have gotten otherwise? Did you win an award? Or did you just collaborate with someone new in the newsroom and get something you wouldn't have gotten otherwise? So in this one, it's finding the mechanisms that your newsroom uses to recognize good work and making sure that you get your work into that as well. Moving on to I, incentives. Journalism often rewards individual outputs, and we can see that in style guides for bylines and also how people are promoted within workplaces. Recognition and advancement are still tied to bylines, even though essential data work is often the product of several, sometimes dozens, sometimes many, many dozens of people. For example, in the New York Times' 2021 Pulitzer-winning COVID coverage, there were 15 entries in it. Only a handful are traditionally written stories with up to about 6 bylines each. 1/3 of the entries are data or interactive stories. But the data pipeline that many of these stories drew on required the work of dozens of people from across the company, many of whom don't really have the same level of acknowledgement as these traditionally written stories that likely drew heavily on their work. But secondly, it's also about career progression frameworks. Often career progression frameworks, if they're written down at all, often focus on individual achievements rather than those that are done in collaboration. Um, when they're not written down, career progression is often based on the perception of other people, and that can introduce a lot of bias and often be biased towards people who work very individually and not with others. So when trying to find some examples of newsroom career progression frameworks online, I did actually kind of run into a little bit of a wall. I will caveat this by saying that it's not that they probably don't exist places, or they're probably just not publicly available. But I did find one article called "The Journalism Career Path Has Changed. Here's How to Embrace the Chaos," which I thought was quite funny. It made sense because the newsroom is kind of inherently chaotic, but we don't actually need to pull our career progression frameworks into that same kind of chaos. If we want to have more collaboration in the newsroom, which essential data work often requires, incentives, particularly formalized incentives, need to change. One of the people that we spoke to for this presentation was Cheryl Phillips, who founded Big Local News, based out of Stanford University. And one of the things that she spoke to us about was the need for clear attribution guidelines. One of the things she talked about was getting to know the motivations of people you're working with. And one of the motivations for organizations for sharing their data is for their original work to be amplified. And having attribution of their work in later work is part of that amplification. And this is a model that would probably work within organizations too, but the style guides and designs for attributions might need to change. So for example, do you have a cap on the number of people who can be bylined? Or how do you determine what names are submitted into words contests? And maybe one question to think about is, should we be normalizing our data preparation bylines in the same way that in audio and video work, you'll often see credits for producers, editors, and engineers. These might be areas that might need a little bit of a rethink. Attribution isn't everything, though, and at the end of the day, you can see what an organization prioritizes and values by looking at its incentive structures. And here I'm talking about bonus structures and salary bands and career progression. If collaboration and sharing of data is something that really is important to the organization, then you have to make that clear in your guidelines when you're giving out bonuses and when you're talking about how to move people up salary bands and what your career progression frameworks look like. I just want to share an example from the engineering progression framework at the FT. This is for the engineering part of the FT organization. Not only are there technical competencies that are expected, but there are also communication, delivery, and leadership competencies, many of which explicitly call for collaboration and knowledge sharing. So you can't get promoted unless if you do these things. Moving on to the M, the money factor. We all kind of know that money is tight in news organizations, and sometimes supporting this kind of work means investing in projects and people who might not immediately generate stories, which still in a lot of cases is the currency, sometimes sole currency of the newsroom. For example, at the FT over the last 2 years, we've hired a data scientist to join our visual and data journalism team to bring more rigorous data cleaning and workflow practices to our work. The work that our data scientist has done has been absolutely transformational, but that came at the expense of being able to hire potentially another reporter who could be writing several stories a week and sometimes perhaps even several stories a day. But I will say that over the last 2 years, we've seen that it's helped us provide much more unique context to the numbers that we report out, and it's been beneficial across many desks in the newsroom. But even for the publishers and management who want to invest in this kind of work, it isn't just as easily done as they might want. Referencing that Reuters Institute report again, 51% of the publishers they surveyed for their 2022 report said that they don't have enough money to invest in innovation this year. But sometimes you don't necessarily have to spend more. You might just need to spend differently. Globally, distinct journalism is the most cited reason that individuals pay for digital news. And the emphasis here is the word distinctive. The value here is in the quality and not the quantity of news. And this means that some of that time spent churning out a quantity of news can be shifted towards some of these investments towards longer term gain, often sometimes even using the same people. But outside of just making these investments pay off in the long run and reprioritizing work within an organization, are there other ways of actually generating some revenue from this work? For one of the examples that we found is ProPublica. They've sold some of the data sets that they've compiled. Big Local News also has something like this as well. They've got a tiered model to get support for the work that they're doing. So there are ways to benefit from this work outside of just writing stories. As we probably all know, Bloomberg and Reuters have put a ton of resources into compiling data sets. And they benefit from having exclusive access to numbers that analysts and actually other journalists will basically pay up the nose for. Newsrooms are generally hesitant to break the wall between newsroom and commercial departments, and generally that makes a lot of sense. But however, find ways to communicate with the commercial side of the business so that they know what you're working on, because they might be able to find some unique value that you have in your team and turn it into a new revenue stream, which could hopefully feed right back into the work that you're doing. Moving on to the last section of S, sustaining change. No matter what the change is really difficult. And this is really hard in newsrooms, partially because of the last point, which is the money factor. There are a lot of pay issues in the industry, as we probably all know, lack of transparency, pay discrepancies for women and people of color. The list really goes on. On top of that, many people who have these kind of deep data and engineering skills can find jobs that pay more, but actually almost more importantly, value their skills more in other industries. Money isn't everything, but it also isn't nothing. And when people leave and there's high employee churn, it's really hard to keep change going. In our A section, we talked about the first 6 steps that John Cotter lays out in his change management book, but I'm going to focus now on the last 2 steps, which are still really important when it comes to sustaining change. Some of the things we will have addressed in the last 2 sections when it comes to tying outcomes in career progression frameworks, bonus structures, setting up business models, but a couple of things that we haven't mentioned yet. As these changes are happening, you want to be able to support and hire employees who are already bought into this new way of working, who can help continue it forward. A common mistake with change management is to just rely on a couple of people just to keep the change going. Employee churn does happen, people do leave, but in some cases, let it be an opportunity. Hire in people who are already bought in and hire in change makers. But also make sure that you're not forgetting the people who are still in the organization, and continue to train internally to help create these new social norms and these new shared values. One of the things to do is to push for employees to get time to do training during their working hours. It's an investment, but it's one that will hopefully pay off. Before we end, we want to thank Cheryl Phillips and Hendrik Lehman and David Menninger for giving us their time to pick their brains on this topic ahead of the talk. But also, we want to end with some questions that we're still thinking about, and we kind of want this to be the beginning of a conversation with people rather than kind of a definitive list of things that we've come up with. We're really keen on hearing about how we can make journalism more collaborative and more cooperative. And it's been really encouraging to hear some of these threads being spoken about in other presentations earlier today. So we definitely want to be able to hear from you about these topics that we didn't get to spend much time on. The more people that we spoke to in preparation for this presentation, the more that we were convinced that this isn't a problem just at the individual newsroom level, but also at an industry level. The kind of single person or star person version of journalism isn't just an issue within the organization, but actually everywhere. So some of the questions that we've got are there business models that could incentivize organizations to work more with each other? How do you develop trust among news organizations so that there is more sharing? And finally, while we think about these ideas, how can we more actively encourage more diversity in these processes? These are just some of the questions that we'd love to discuss after this. But until then, thanks for listening, and we hope to hear more from you about these topics.
So essentially, do we need to get back to the office to do data journalism properly? And I'm just going to talk through the experience of what we've found so far and give a bit of background. First off, this was the Evening Standard's front page last Thursday. Evening Standard circulates in London, for those of you who don't know it. We distribute about 500,000 copies a day. And on the same day, this was a picture of the newsroom. There we are, that's me in the newsroom. You may not be quite apparent from the picture, but there are a lot of empty desks and a lot of black screens. I think I was one of about 6 or 7 people in the newsroom. Pre-pandemic, they would have been around 100, and many heads would have been turning while I was taking that picture. So it just shows how things have changed. The paper still comes out, but very few people actually bother to turn up at the newsroom in Kensington anymore. So this will give a sense of what we're going to talk about here. Essentially, I'll give you a bit of my own background, what's been happening at the Standard, what it was like before the pandemic kicked in, what it's like now, and really to try and answer the question here, is the future of journalism to be found at the bottom of a spreadsheet? So pre-pandemic, back, February 2020, it's almost so long ago we slightly forget when it was, there were about 900,000 to 930,000 copies a day of the Evening Standard, 2 editions a day, distributed across the entire city, mainly in central London. You'd have 10, 20, 30,000 copies a day outside Holborn Tube Station, Liverpool Street Station, and so on. Many out to the boundaries of the city. Many been taken out of the city by train commuters. So it wouldn't be unusual to see a copy of the Standard make its way all the way to Glasgow or down to Brighton or down to Cornwall. The history of the Standard, it used to be a paid-for paper. It's been going probably more than 160 years now. Back when I started, back in 2002, it used to be 40 pence. And there were people, street vendors, all around outside tube stations shouting Standard, Standard, and selling it for 40p. It gradually went up to 50p, but in October 2009, the new owners decided to make it a free paper because the circulation had gone down, and the decision was made that it would actually be more economically sensible to increase the cost of advertising in return for far greater distribution and get rid of the cover price. But so just a month or so after the pandemic began in March 2020, we took the decision to reduce the print run to 500,000, and many of those were distributed to readers direct to their homes. We set up a home delivery scheme, particularly in the more affluent parts of London, where more of our readers tend to live, the sort of Kensington, Chelsea, Fulham, parts of the world around Zones 1 and Zones 2, Westminster, City of London, etc. Because at that time, London had come to a complete standstill. It was rather a ghost town, and people weren't using the tube or the buses, so therefore weren't walking past the stacks of the paper that they would do pre-pandemic. This also overlapped with a new strategy to go web first and prioritise news online rather than holding on to stories or ignoring stories that would break outside of our normal deadlines. We would get them online as quickly as possible and aim to build our web traffic. And what's happened is that there's been a dramatic increase in the number of people looking at the Evening Standard website. Sort of pre-pandemic, you might have around 650,000 visits a day. Now it's sort of typically up to 2 million a day and sometimes more. Just a pictorial example of what it's like before. In addition to covering health, I also cover City Hall and the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. That's him on the left with me with my kilt on. I don't normally wear a kilt when I'm out on the patch, but that was a special dinner. And the picture on the right is sort of mid-pandemic. I think I was going up to visit a hospital, and at the time the rules on the tube were that you had to wear a mask. So in terms of web first, what has this meant for reporters? Well, largely, you could say it's actually just meant we've had to work an awful lot harder and a lot quicker. For the more senior reporters, those who have a patch, the sort of specialist reporters like myself, it means that the paper still comes first. We still have to prioritise finding stories for the next day's paper or that morning's paper, essentially start early in the morning and drive towards the 10 a.m. deadline for news copy. But we are encouraged to write stories for the website when we're off edition, as in when the paper has gone to press, but the day hasn't finished. But there's still that constant pressure of the next day's paper is the one that matters. So here's a sort of summary of my day. Sort of 6:30, I'm at my laptop or in the office. If I go into the office, I normally cycle in, so it really requires me to get up at 5:30 and cycle in across London. But sort of by 6:30, 7 o'clock, really you want to be having checked all your emails. If you haven't already done that from the night before, check what's on the BBC news website, check what's on the political website, which is particularly useful now. I think it's probably even better than the Press Association schedule. Have a tune into the Today programme, see which guests are coming up there. And by 7 a.m, normally you're starting to tap away to send a list of possible stories to the news editor or to start actually filing the stories over to the news desk. There's a news conference meeting with the various editors and the main editor sort of around 8 o'clock now. And by 8:30, I've normally got some feedback from the news desk, what they're interested in, what they're not, rough sort of word counts and so on. And then it's sort of, head down, full steam ahead up until the 10 o'clock deadline. That's when the copy deadline is for reporters, and that gives the sub-editors an hour or so to tidy up the copy, put the headlines on, insert the pictures, and send the paper off to the printers. The big problem that has always been the case for the Standard with very tight morning deadlines, unlike the Nationals that obviously have deadlines in the evening for the following day's paper, there's every chance that something big could happen early in the morning and you've got to react quickly to get it in the paper. And the way this has happened, particularly with COVID and the sheer volume of data and health data that was coming out, especially at 9:30, was really the challenge of how do you make the right call? Which data do you look for? What do you ignore? What matters, what doesn't, and how do you contextualize it? So this was an example of the kind of things that were available early on in the pandemic. Things have changed a bit now as data has slightly dried up in terms of the scale of the pandemic, in terms of monitoring what's happening. But the main data then, and I think it's still true now, was from the Office of National Statistics, which at 9:30 on Tuesday would give us the latest mortality figures. And also on Friday, it would sum up, it's now the sort of infection report, but it would give a good sense of the surveillance in terms of infection. So both we would know the Tuesday data worked for the Evening Standard because it was just in time. The Friday midday data was too late for the paper, but we would do that online. The Department of Health and Social Care would issue the test and trace statistics at 11 o'clock on a Thursday. Test and trace obviously is no longer a story anymore, really, but there were many, many months when that was absolutely top of the agenda. Public Health England now has obviously renamed itself, but it would have a very useful surveillance report that would come out on Thursday afternoons. That was particularly good for us because its data was broken down to borough level. If you wanted to dig into it, it actually rewarded interrogation, and you could do some very useful local stories, setting out in quite a lot of detail which London boroughs had higher or lower rates of infection. There was the government's own COVID dashboard, which just seems to get better and better. But I think many people now know how it works. So having reporters interpret it perhaps is not as necessary now as may have been the case. And then obviously where they had the R number as well from the Government Office for Science on Friday afternoons. Now, one of the key things about this data is, especially data that breaks late, is the importance of interpreting it, and probably none more so than this story here. Now, this actually came from a briefing organised by the Science Media Centre, which essentially invites health and science journalists to either in-person or virtual briefings in London, fronted by researchers. And here there was new research led by an academic in Liverpool into the number of cases of babies admitted with Omicron. And essentially, because there had been a lot of sort of speculation that actually Omicron was particularly dangerous in young babies, and young children. And what this found was, yes, the numbers had gone up, but most were not severely affected at all. So here, great care was needed in how the data was presented and reported, because the potential for causing huge concern amongst parents was definitely there. So this is one of the examples of how you've really got to be very careful in how you interpret data. Another example here, this is just a recent story about the kind of data stories that existed for us. This was a couple of months ago, Chris Whitty below. This became sort of fairly standard, looking sort of week on week at up, down, what was happening really. One of the big things that became of interest was not just infections and deaths, but then boosters. And again, London seemed to lag behind the rest of the country. There was an issue about fewer Londoners coming forward. There was another issue about the shortage of supply of vaccines in London. That was said by the government to be primarily because there were fewer older Londoners. Obviously, older Britons got the vaccine first. So with London being a younger city, it took quite a while to catch up and has never really caught up. I think last time I looked, about 25 to 30% of Londoners remain unvaccinated. But this was another example of how we sort of covered the new data as it sort of emerged as the pandemic progressed. Again, another example here of the sort of thing that was, really not too difficult to do, but tended to do well online. There was always a lot of online interest in borough by borough comparisons or borough v borough comparisons. And if suddenly you found that your borough was one with a very high infection rate, that did well for us. And the benefit, of course, with stories that are up online is that you can look at the analytics on a almost second by second basis, so you can see very clearly, very quickly what is working. Now, this one here, again, one of the more recent ones. Every now and then you got your sort of peaks and troughs. And again, this one again was sort of following the data, but choosing when to report it. Because there we had a sort of sudden peak. I think this was around sort of March, April time, and this was linked as well with concern amongst clinicians that many patients being admitted with COVID were unvaccinated. And this was one of the first stories about COVID that sort of made the front page in terms of looking at the numbers. And this was concerned about the way the numbers were being reported or presented by official sources and actually failing to fully tap into the true death toll, because there was at the time there was the difference between the sort of 28 days or the mortality after 28 days of infection, then after I think 60 days it became, and in the end there was a general sense that many more people, certainly in London, could correctly have their death attributed to the pandemic than was being the case. And here it is probably quite hard to see, but just on the right-hand column there on the front page to the right of the picture, that is 1 million Londoners have coronavirus. That was the first time we hit that landmark figure. And it's always interesting as well. I think looking back, you think, gosh, that must have been a monumental moment. But there, the editors decided that it wasn't worthy of the actual splash story, but nevertheless did make the front page. But again, landmark numbers always make good news. Now, what have we learned looking back on this? First off, obviously, the ONS is by all means the gold standard, and I think its numbers are regarded as being the best to use, although Imperial's REACT study has also been very good, very useful as well, and that also gives regional breakdowns. Quite amazing how many people have willingly volunteered to send their data into Imperial, but it's a shame. I think that's rather sort of run out of steam now due to lack of government funding. But we've got the ONS at least to rely on. Test and trace, as I mentioned earlier, has rather disappeared. What we noticed as well, of course, was that the dashboard could be hugely misleading in terms of what it was telling us, in that it could tell you the number of patients, I think, in hospital, but it only became clear later on that many of the patients with COVID in hospitals, many were there not because of COVID, but had simply tested positive in hospital for COVID. That later became something that many news organisations were able to clarify because NHS England decided to clarify the data. And I think it was the last time I recall reporting on this, it was probably only about a quarter to a third of COVID patients in London hospitals were there primarily because of COVID. So again, it gave a different sense of the scale of the pandemic. And similarly with, there was a sort of lack of data for how long people were staying in hospital with COVID. It was unclear how many beds there were, for example. This again was a big issue, were London hospitals overcrowded? Well, we never quite got to know that. We did know, for example, that say the Royal London Hospital opened 2 floors in its giant building just for intensive care for COVID patients, but we never really knew for sure whether every COVID bed was taken in the city in one day, partly because hospitals can flex up and down. But again, that was a sort of gap in the data. And one of the great bugbears for me was the gap in data on how many survived. Often I would ask hospitals, but how many have you discharged back home, sort of safe after treatment? And the reality, of course, was that for every 50 or 100 who died in their care, probably 10 times that number would have been saved. So actually, although the numbers were appalling in terms of the deaths, there was a massive success story as well, in that many, many people were saved and many more were saved than died. And this was something that has never really been fully sort of explored or articulated, I would say, although there was obviously a recent Lancet study, I think it was last Friday or Saturday, that worldwide 20 million deaths were prevented due to vaccinations. And obviously that's slightly different to hospital care, but it just shows it's not been all bad news in the pandemic. There have been major steps forward, both in healthcare and in science, that have saved many lives. Now, in terms of what happens next, what I think has happened in particular is this availability of data and the knowledge amongst readers that so much of this data exists has almost sort of enabled the formation of an army of citizen journalists who will not only use the health data or the COVID data, but look for data from other sources. For example, in London, there are many clean air campaigners who are very active and now know where to look for the clean air data, or the dirty air data, as it actually tends to turn out to be. Does this show readers are more interested in statistics? Well, maybe not. I'm not so sure. The last thing you want to do, going back to sort of journalism school, is bog a story down in statistics. I always think you want to talk about people first if you can, but certainly a good journalist should always back up their arguments or their facts, or use facts and statistics to back up a narrative wherever possible. There are many other sources of official data, from NHS board papers to council agenda papers. And another benefit here in terms of understanding data has been the use of webcasts, especially by local authorities, so that people can sit at home and watch on their laptop rather than having to trek down to the town hall to sit in the cold and listen to a dull council meeting. Now they can log in and out, and quite often catch up on YouTube on a meeting that may have happened at a bad time for them, but they can check the next day and find out exactly what they want to know. So, I would say that there's more data out there, but also greater awareness of data now, and also this is being used to expose inequalities. This is just an example here of, again, how data can be used to sort of turn itself into quite easy stories. This was an example of one of the sort of more immediate fallouts from the pandemic was the waiting lists for NHS care. And here we were able to show, just through crunching some NHS England data, how many Londoners were waiting for cancer care. Again, the similar theme again here. This was sort of using the vaccine stats to show proportion of Londoners who are still waiting to get their jab. There was some good data on, by age group on the population. However, the problem with the vaccination stats, where there's this disparity between the ONS census data, or the ONS data that relied on the 2011 census, and the NHS, what was called the NIMS database, which is essentially the register used by GPs of the number of vaccines given out. So the two didn't tally, and quite often just because of population moving in and out of London. So it was always a little bit of a sort of finger in the wind to work out what exactly the situation was. But both numbers indicated there that London was not doing as well as it could, certainly compared to other big cities in the UK in terms of vaccine take-up. Similar theme again there, and just in terms of sort of fighting for a jab, so you can easily use the data to turn the story into a bit of a campaign, should you wish. However, what I would say though is that data is not all, and the old sort of fashioned thing I remember back in journalism college being taught that, when you get a new patch, get on Shanksy's pony, go and wear out your shoes or get yourself a bike and cycle around your new patch, and be inquisitive, inquire, ask awkward questions, try and pick up things. And I think that still holds absolutely true today in the world of big data. And just a few examples, like a few weeks ago, I had the most improbable story. I had accompanied Sadiq Khan on a sort of week-long trip to the US, and simply by speaking to contacts, it's over breakfast one day once we were back, suddenly it became clear that actually he had been due to meet Meghan and Harry in California. However, that trip never came about, that he had invited them to a party he was hosting. They were unable to come, and invited Sadiq to their mansion in, I think, Beverly Hills. It would have been an incredible meeting had it happened, but it was still quite an interesting story that the offer had been made on both sides and didn't quite come about. This was just before the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, and it may have been the case that Sadiq did not want to be seen to be on side Harry and Meghan against side the Queen and Prince William. But nevertheless, it was an unusual story. And another example was just doing a tour of my own local hospital here in East London, and finding out through speaking to people on the ground that actually many London hospitals were delayed in terms of being rebuilt because of a lack of funds, a sort of story that you would not get just from looking at data and tuning into meetings. Last week, I was at a bus garage in West Ham, of all places, where Sadiq Khan was giving a speech, and actually it was very unusual, not just for him to give a speech, but suddenly to invite the media to this out-of-the-way bus garage. But actually, what became clear after doing the official interviews on camera was that the long-awaited bailout from the government for Transport for London had not come about, that only 3 more weeks' worth of funding had been provided. So again, these are the stories you pick up just around the edges. And finally, probably the most useful one for the Evening Standard that I picked up recently, again, just through old-fashioned knowing your contacts and being trusted by the right people, is that the opening of Crossrail, a massive new rail line across the centre of the capital, the Queen was due to open that, but there was a huge amount of uncertainty about whether she could actually turn up because of her recent health problems. And she was due to visit at 9:30, 10 o'clock. Actually, that was incorrect. It was actually at 11 a.m. on a Tuesday. And I was able to confirm, I think about 9:45, that she would in fact be appearing, which enabled us to get the story on the front page. And if we just go to the next slide, we should hopefully see the effect of that. There we are. So it basically made all the difference that we were able to go for sure with the picture of the Queen and essentially save space in the paper right on deadline, right on 11 o'clock, not even the reporter's deadline at 10, but at 11 o'clock, when everything's got to go, that we could write a story in advance, slot in the picture, have the headline ready, and press go as soon as she'd essentially stepped out of her limousine. So in summary, I think what I'm trying to say is that stories have got to be about people. And I always remember being told by a news editor that, to remember that journalism is as much about the entertainment industry as other things, a sort of infotainment, that you've got to catch their eye. Many people have got so many other things going on in their life, and you've got to win their time and win their interest. And much of this relies on old-fashioned techniques, contacts, seeking other voices. Is journalism a team game? Well, from a colleague before, it sounded like the FT works very closely together. It's not so much the case on the Standard, a sort of smaller and more tabloidy paper, where essentially it feels like many of the senior reporters are almost like sole traders. We're all sort of market traders. I can offer potatoes, a colleague can often offer aubergines and tomatoes, another one can offer apples and bananas, and it's for the editor to decide what she wants in a shopping basket that day. And if I get 2 dozen potatoes in the paper, then there's fewer bananas. So it's often your rivals or your own team members at the same time, rather than everybody working together. However, being in the newsroom can mean that you can share ideas, pick up ideas, and it's all about the sort of fertilization of ideas. The best data or the search for the data can be driven really most usefully by having a good idea first, then seeking the data to find it out, rather than staring at data and trying to work out what the story is. That's a very difficult thing to do when there is so much data there. Rather, you want to think, I wonder what if this is the case, and then you can perhaps find the data to back it up and find out if that theory is correct or not. So what I would say is that presenteeism is dead. You really don't need to be in the office all the time. I would suggest 1 or 2 days a week. That's sort of roughly what I'm doing just now. pop down to City Hall at least once a week if I can. So you don't have to get out of the spare room or out of the kitchen, but you do probably have to get away from that kitchen table and get away from that some of the time to do the job properly. Thank you very much.
So my team sits within a fairly new department at the BBC called the Local News Partnerships. We set up around 4 years ago. And the Local News Partnerships is a series of initiatives that the BBC has embarked on in partnership with the regional press. So we have a formal partnership, and there's a series of initiatives in which we can explore ways of working closer together. And local news organisations sign up to that partnership. We've now got more than 1,500 partners on board, and they represent, they're from local radio to TV to some hyperlocals, local newspapers, so a broad range of regional media across the UK. And there's various initiatives. The one you may have heard of is the Local Democracy Reporting Service, which the BBC funds 165 local democracy reporters, and their job is to cover the workings of town halls. They sit in town hall, local council meetings, licensing committees, planning committees, and so on, and cover local democracy at its source. And that hit the headlines last week when the Mayor of Bristol announced that he was no longer welcoming the local democracy reporter for Bristol to his mayoral briefings. We also have an initiative called News Hub, which is when the BBC opens up its regional television output and makes it available to our local news partners to use on their websites. And then we have the shared data unit, which is me. So what do we do? Well, we are a collaborative data journalism team. We're a digital team. We use data as a source for our stories. We do public interest journalism. We use text source data, work collaboratively, and transparency is at the heart of what we do. And I know some of the speakers earlier talked about how important that is for data journalists to be transparent and to open up the data that they use and their methodologies. I was quite interested to hear, that there was there was an assessment that that's perhaps not particularly welcomed by the audience or used, and I think that's probably right. But we still do it, and I think we open up everything on our GitHub page, and I think it's the principle. It's the principle of being within the data journalism community and having those values of transparency and accountability at the heart of what we do. And we have, we also see ourselves as data advocates, and we believe that publicly funded data should be publicly available. So if data is held by local authorities, local councils, local NHS trusts about us, and it's funded by us, it should be publicly available. And our aims would be to enhance and support local data journalism across the UK. So when we had conversations with the local news partnerships, when we were setting them up 4 years ago, we identified a problem, and that was effectively a tsunami of open data, a surplus of data being released every day, and not enough journalists with the skills to analyse it or to tell stories from it. And that's not to say that there weren't absolute pockets of excellence across the country. Claire's team being the pioneers of data journalism back in the day and proving an inspiration to many of us. But I think it's fair to say that, across maybe like local telly and local radio, there was plenty of journalists without the technical skills to get stuck into data sets. And we wanted to change that and see if we could address that balance. So how do we do that? Thanks. We do that through training, journalism and events. I'll take those in turn. So to start with training, we offer free training to journalists that have signed up to the local news partnerships, data journalism and investigative journalism training. prior to the pandemic, we offered that all online. We offered it in person. We're based in the mailbox in Birmingham, and we would welcome journalists for 3 months secondments. So they would join us for 3 months, work with the team, have some formal training during those months, and then we would send them back to their newsrooms, and they would be far better equipped to tackle data sets and tell news stories from data. But obviously that we were mid-secondment when March 23rd happened, and we were all sent home. I remember the sort of technicians coming around and saying, you might be using this program, so we're just going to install it. You might be using this a bit more. And it was Zoom, which we'd kind of never seen before, but it's obviously become so ubiquitous in our lives. And so we moved online, and we offer all our training online now. And we offer that in different formats to suit different journalistic needs. We have Tuesday drop-in sessions in which journalists can join us for over their lunchtime and learn a new skill. We have week-long masterclasses, which are a bit more intensive and take journalists on more of a journey. And that's a kind of Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 program. And then we have a chapterized version of that masterclass, which takes place every Monday afternoon. So that's for journalists that can't commit to a week, but could perhaps put an afternoon aside over 10 weeks. And that's the things we do really. We teach journalists how to use spreadsheets. We teach them like the fundamentals of data, how data is stored and structured, and what it is to look at a spreadsheet. Why should people be interested in it? We talk about investigative story method and how to kind of apply a hypothesis-led approach to journalism. How to plan that and progress it and follow the scientific method. We do technical stuff using the various free sort of off-the-shelf data tools that are available, Flourish, Data Wrapper, so that journalists can make their own data viz and make their own maps. And then we'll talk about merging data sets, VLOOKUP functions, where to source data, advanced internet search, and so on. And how to use statistics, how to apply statistics to data. So if you join the masterclass, you kind of get all that, or you could just drop in and join us on a kind of Tuesday and pick up one of those skills. I guess why we're doing this, I've talked about a kind of tsunami of data, there's so many data portals, many of them covered today, from the NHS to the police to the COVID dashboard, which became a data journalist's go-to every day. But also like local data portals, Birmingham Data Factory, and then there's like Leeds Data Mill and London and so on. So all these places releasing data on a daily basis. And this rather ugly data viz is from the Open the Transparency Index, and it ranks governments on how well they are making their data publicly accessible. And Great Britain comes third, just joint with Australia. So it gets a high score for transparency. I don't think we can blame the authorities too much in terms of open data. I think we're kind of ahead of other countries in terms of that. And on data.gov.uk alone, there's something like 40,000 data sets now and growing. So there's an awful lot for journalists to get their teeth into. And I did a usage survey of certain, looking at how much of this data was being used that was released by kind of local authorities, and a lot of it is sitting there kind of untouched and unexamined. An example would be the Northern Ireland Assembly, the devolved government of Northern Ireland. I looked at their usage, and they'd released something like 1,500 data sets over the last 5 years, and a third of them had had just 500 had had just one download, and 93% had 20 visits or fewer. So this was replicated across other local authorities and regional centres. A lot of this data is kind of not being looked at by journalists, and coming back to that skills gap, which we'd sort of identified. There was a survey last year, and it showed that there was something like only a fifth of the a fifth of the global workforce say that they would be competent in their data literacy skills, that they'd be able to find a data set and analyze it or find insights from it. So there's that problem: too much data and not enough technical skills out there. We've been running that training for 4 years now. Like I say, all of it is online. We did see a tangible impact from that. There was journalists from JPI, 3 of the largest regional publishers in the UK, set up data journalism teams on the back of the staff that we had trained, and started to produce really interesting regional data journalism. So that's our training. Secondly, another key aspect of what we do is the work we publish. So we publish data journalism stories, which we share collaboratively with our partner network. So we tend to focus on public interest stories that have a regional focus, and we put together a toolkit of parts for journalists to use. So we source the data, we clean up the data, we analyze it, we get the background, context, and then we share that with our regional partners and with the wider BBC as well. And hopefully there'll be a story there that they can run that will resonate with their region and with their audience. Just a couple we did. Councils fearing bankruptcy costs after COVID, and really sad story about hundreds of people had died, that were terminally ill, been stripped of their benefits, and died appealing the decision. And that content is used by our regional partners, and these are some of the front pages from around the country, that the data that we've generated, the journalism that's been done on the back of the data that we've generated. And I'll just talk through how that works in practice with a recent story. And it's actually got this screenshot. Should be able to play. Go back. Is there a play? Like it. No worries. This was me experimenting, and I thought I'd managed to do a video capture of this, and I knew this was going to be the crunch point, but it doesn't matter. I can talk through it. It hasn't worked. This was a story that we did recently on NHS dentistry, and we'd looked at how many dentists had left the NHS in recent years. And we had a data over a 6-year period, and it showed how for each local authority in the UK, how many NHS dentists they'd lost, and what percentage that was. So it's really quite a simple story to tell. But what we do is we create an R Markdown document that we host on our GitHub page, and we try and make it as rather than giving people a spreadsheet which they might not be comfortable with, we make it into a Markdown document with searchable tables So what does the data show? People can type in their local authority and get the data for their region with the percentage of dentists that have left the NHS. There's your top line. You know, you live in Northampton, you tap in Northampton, and it will tell you, and I'm making the figure up, 20% of NHS dentists have left in the last 5 years. But also we have other sections on there, like what do the experts say and rights of reply. So we send all that out as well. So journalists don't have to ring the British Dental, so hundreds of journalists around the country don't all ring the British Dental Association to get a comment. We send the comment as well. So it's a toolkit of parts for people to put together the story that works for them. And what the experts say as well. So we'll speak to dentists and so on. And that was used by something like 70 local titles around the country. And 2 days after its publication, the government announced a 50 million investment in NHS dentistry. They denied a link, and I can't prove one, but I'm going to say it anyway. Yeah, I mean, another story, just to get a flavour of the kind of stories we do, would be we used a piece of open source software called Web X-Ray, designed by a coder called Tim Libert, and it can tell you how many cookies are on a website. Basically, it crawls websites and tells you how many cookies, advertising cookies in this example. So we wanted to find out how many advertising cookies were on council websites, local authority websites. So this is Torbay Council advertising Black Friday. And this is, I think it's Sheffield. I think I picked Sheffield as example, advertising the Lion King, and North Somerset with advertising luxury cars. And we even found high interest credit cards being advertised. And the key thing here is that these are all benefits pages as well. They're information pages. So they're pages where people on low incomes would go to get information and support, and they were being flashed adverts for high interest credit cards, and we found 950 of these across local authorities across the UK. And the guy behind the open source software said this may be the most unexpected place I've seen an ad online. And the interesting thing is that local authorities didn't seem to know either, so they just outsourced all this. They you know, a company came along and said, we'll give you 15 grand and if we can put cookies on your website, and councils, being as hard up as they have been, took the money and didn't even know. Yeah, and the story we ran a couple of weeks ago was just about representation at UK music festivals. Only 13% of headliners this year across every festival were women. And that's despite a pledge 5 years ago to make festivals much more representative at a headline level. And there was all these festivals signed up to a 50-50 pledge, and they're failing on it. We kind of used some scraped data from housing websites. This was from spareroom.co.uk, and we found that loads of landlords on Spareroom, something like 1,300 to be precise, were ticking a box saying their properties weren't available to people on benefits, which went against the High Court ruling that was discrimination. So this was, Spareroom hadn't got around to sort of implementing this High Court ruling, and we found that actually pets were more popular than people on benefits when it came to landlords renting out their properties, which is quite staggering to us. And finally, thirdly, we do events as well. So we hold an annual data journalism conference, but we also hold hack days throughout the year, and we bring together journalists from our regional news partners. We just held an event in Birmingham in which we brought about 30 journalists together from around the country, and we're looking at toxic abuse on Twitter. And we used Google's Perspective AI, which ranks tweets for their toxicity effectively, to look at the debate, and to look at how our online debate has become so toxic. And that's going to be a purely collaborative effort. So we're going to share all that data. We're going to share it around our partnership. It was created with our partners. It will be disseminated amongst our partners. We'll all publish on the same day. And I think that's a really example of really exciting collaborative journalism. It's, at a local level. We've seen how you can get these huge data leaks, like the Panama Papers and WikiLeaks, have led to cross-national collaboration across newspapers and news orgs. But this is what we're trying to do at a regional level, because how can we drive? What do we have in common, and where can we work together for the common good and for the benefit of our audiences? So during the pandemic, we trained upwards of 400 people, 400 journalists, and our data has generated something like 1,700 local stories across our network. Next week, we're running our first coding academy for journalists. So we're going to be in Cardiff, and we've got 10 people coming down to learn how to code over 2 days. And I think I've run out of time, and that's me. So that's our team, our Twitter handles. We also have a GitHub page, which anyone can access us. We've got all our data methodology. And if anyone wants to get in touch and find out more about the project, we have a website, bbc.com/LNP for local news partnerships /SDU. And our group email is shared.dataunit@bbc.co.uk.
So I'm Nathan Sparks, I'm Chief Executive of the Hacks Off campaign, and what we do is campaign on issues of media freedom and standards in the press. I'm also on the board of the Media Reform Coalition, which campaigns on sort of progressive media policy more broadly, and the Independent Media Association, which represents about 50 or 60 independent news publishers with high standards based across the UK, including one based here in Sheffield called Now Then. So this presentation will set out 3 principles for working ethically with data. They're all based on our experience at Hacked Off, scrutinising standards in the press. One thing you'll notice throughout the presentation is that the names of journalists are all redacted, because one of the key points for this is not about journalists, and it's not about individual newspapers either, although all of these examples are real. It's not about individual people or publications. These are all patterns and issues that we've detected with standards around working with data in the journalism industry. So the first of those principles is being assured of the integrity of the data that journalists are working with, and being transparent when you can't be assured of that. So here's a story from a few years ago. This appeared in the Metro newspaper. Does having a TV in your bedroom lead to more sex? Well, it could be true. It sounds unlikely, but it could be true, I suppose. But there is nothing in this article which explains who actually carried out the poll. Who were the pollsters? What questions were asked? How was the sample chosen? All that we have is, all we do know is that it was commissioned by this company called VoucherCodesPro.co.uk, who get a quote, a lengthy quote in the article. And they even speculate at the end. They say, if you were wondering how to improve your sex lives, you could simply do so by purchasing a TV for your bedroom. Now, I use the Wayback Machine, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. You can look at on websites from a certain time. I used that to find out what was happening on Voucher Codes Pro's website at this time, on this specific date. And sure enough, they were running a promotion for new televisions. So if you, next one please. So if we look at a couple of other similar kinds of stories, again, these stories, they follow a pattern. They're kind of interesting poll-based, sort of lifestyle, entertainment kind of stories. And we've got one here, half of Gen Z admits social media is the only place they can be themselves. This was commissioned by Adobe, which had just released a series of tools for digitally altering your appearance, presumably to then post those images to social media. And another poll about adults appreciate the French lifestyle, commissioned by a bakery. But in both of these cases, we do know who the pollsters are, at least. They are a company called OnePoll. Now, OnePoll, they're not listed as a member of the British Polling Council, which is very significant because if you're a member of the British Polling Council, you have to abide by standards of transparency and so on in your polls. You have to publish the details of the pollster themselves has to publish the details of the poll, the full data and everything else. And OnePoll aren't a member, and they don't appear, from what I can see on their website, to publish their questions for public review themselves, and all the details of sample and all those other very important details. What they are, if you go to their website, it appears to me at least to be a marketing company that will offer to run polls on behalf of other private companies and then seek to get stories based on those poll results into national newspapers and local newspapers as well. And I don't want to, by the way, they're owned by a company which also runs their own newswire service. So there's a kind of a complete kind of package going on there. And I don't want to be too critical of OnePoll because that's just marketing. That's a marketing company doing marketing, good marketing. They're getting sort of results for their companies into the newspapers, and that's their job. But I do think there's a responsibility on journalists and newspapers to ensure they're not just becoming tools in these marketing campaigns, and to ensure that if they are going to publish the results of polls like this, they look into the data and how it was formed and be assured of the integrity of that data, or if they can't be assured of that, at the very least, be transparent about what they do know and what they don't know about where that data has come from. And how sample is chosen and how polls are done is so important. If you don't mind going to the next slide. So a few examples. So the Express newspaper is known for doing this. It does polls of its own readers, often via Twitter, and then uses that as the basis for a story. Now this one, staggering poll, shows 94% of readers believe we haven't got the Brexit we voted for. You might expect that of Express readers, because the Express is a very enthusiastically Brexit-supporting newspaper. That's, of course, dramatically different from public perceptions of Brexit. These aren't a direct comparison, they're different questions, but the results taken from a YouGov poll here, which is a member of the British Polling Council, suggests that the 94% figure perhaps isn't reflective of the general population. And again, there's another one here about the House of Lords. Again, it's an Express reader poll, a public poll. I don't want to be too critical of the Express here, because look, in their headlines, they have said that 94% of readers. They could perhaps have been a bit more clear about that, but they have at least set out in the headline that it is a poll of readers, and it's not a general poll. But I use these examples just to illustrate why it's so important that the transparency of the poll and the integrity of the data is if we're reporting on polls. So that's principle one, be assured of the integrity of the data. Principle two, and this should almost go without saying, but present the data accurately. So this was a story from November 2015, and it was published in the Sun newspaper just 1 week after the terror attack in Paris, which was attributed to ISIS. And it's a very shocking headline, a very volatile time, which essentially kind of, the claim is that 20% of British Muslims have violent or extremist sympathies. So it was a very you want to make sure it's right if that's true. So but then the next then we find what happened next is that Salvation, who carried out the poll and are a member of the British Polling Council, actually went out of their way to directly criticise how that poll had been represented by the Sun, because it was an inaccurate representation of the poll itself. What British Muslims had been asked was not, are you sympathetic with jihadis? They were asked, are you sympathetic with those fighting in Syria, which could have referred to people fighting on either side of the conflict. And there were some other concerns with how the Sun had laid as well. In fact, Survation's findings on that poll, their conclusions, their takeaways from that question was that the results from British Muslims to that question was broadly the same as the results of when the general population were asked. So their key takeaway is that this shows that there is not a problem with extremism among Muslims in the UK, which is almost the opposite of what the Sun was alleging. Now, if you just pause for a minute, just because the next slide, just to highlight the seriousness of getting stuff wrong on this. The next slide will show in a minute people on racist people on a white supremacist website sharing that specific article and saying, look, it's no surprise to us, you know, and essentially using that story as propaganda for kind of their white supremacist beliefs. So I'm not going to read it out, but if you go to the next slide just for briefly, you can see these are real screenshots from a real white supremacist website. This is another example of a story in which the data was not accurately presented. And this is a story from the Telegraph. The war on meat has begun. There are many reasons to join the resistance. It's this figure here, a meta-analysis of the peer-reviewed papers on this topic. And this whole article is about about claiming that kind of the arguments that we should eat less meat to help the environment and so on are bogus. That's the argument of this article. A recent meta-analysis, all peer-reviewed papers on this topic, found that giving up meat altogether would cut individuals' total emissions by just 4.3%. That statistic is not linked to, and it's not clear exactly where it comes from or what meta-analysis that is. So, but you can find out. This was called out by Bob Ward, who's a climate scientist from LSE, and it turns out that the original response to him from the person who came up with that figure, who didn't write that article, but is someone who is often commentates on climate science issues. He sarcastically replies to him, well done. And he actually reveals here where he gets that 4.3% figure from. And this is the study in question. Now that study doesn't refer to 4.3% either. What that study was about was how much CO2 emissions are produced by a single person based on their diet. So then he uses that figure to compare it with the total amount of emissions that individuals are believed to be responsible for throughout their lives. And that's how he gets this 4.3% figure. However, if you go to the next slide, that specific study only measured people in 4 countries. And those were, which the Telegraph later admitted, by the way, and this clarification was at the bottom of that Telegraph article. They admitted this much, from the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, and India. Well, if you look at this is the ranking from Our World in Data of the most meat consumption, highest meat consumption countries in the world, you'll see that none of those 4 countries are in the top 10, 15, 20 or so. So actually it's likely to be a very unrepresentative group. So if you cut meat out of a United States or a Hong Kong citizen's diet, for example, the impact of that is likely to be much more than 4.3%. And what's more is that, so it's not representative in general, but what's more, it's not even representative of people in the UK, because the UK comes second on that list further down at about 200 kilograms. India was 10 kilograms. So you're going to get a hugely skewed result for that. It's not a reliable figure used in the way it has been. And it's in our view, it's not an ethical use of data to just sort of concoct these figures from studies in this way, not bringing in the full context, and just to put it in unlinked and not explained in the article as it was done. So that's principle 2, and then there's one more, which is principle 3, and this is putting data in its proper context. Now, in these examples, the data is accurate. It is true, but there's some really critical context that's missing. So this is a Daily Mail story from November 2020. What they don't tell you about COVID, and the thrust of the narrative of the story is that COVID is not nearly as bad as we've all been told. Mortality rates are much lower than were ever predicted. The lockdowns and everything else was an overreaction and unnecessary infringement on our freedoms and so on. And in fact, the Department of Health actually took the unprecedented step of actually criticising the article on social media, although they quickly took it back down afterwards, because for the reasons which I'm just about to explain. So yes, so if you have a look at the article itself, this is taken from the article. So this is one line. So July report commissioned by Sir Patrick Vallance estimates 119,000 deaths if the second spike coincides with winter flu. And yesterday that figure stood at just 54,000. So the point, the argument is that deaths are much lower than what was predicted. Now, I looked up that report that they refer to, and if you go to the next slide, it was published in the summer of 2020, at which point it was government policy. We've had one lockdown in March, there will not be another one. No second lockdown under any circumstances. That was government policy at that time. So this report is all based on the premise that there would not be a second lockdown. We consider a scenario in which it is not possible to respond to a rising instance of COVID-19 with a lockdown of similar effectiveness to that imposed in March. So that prediction, which comes down here, 119,000, is based on the idea that there won't be another full second lockdown. But there was a full second lockdown in November, just 3 weeks before the Mail published that article. So the Mail's, the thrust of the Mail's argument is that there were estimates there were going to be a very high death toll, and there wasn't, so we've overreacted. The reality was, the scientists said, if you don't act, if there isn't a lockdown, there will be a very high death toll. There was a lockdown, and now it's lower than their estimates, as you would expect following the second lockdown. And the article goes on. There's another piece here. Its warnings on deaths simply don't bear any relation to reality. During the Halloween Horror Show press conference, this was so named towards the end of October or start of November, around that time. This was the press conference where the Prime Minister announced the second lockdown, by the way. They're accusing Vallance and Whitty of trying to scare the government into implementing a second lockdown. One of the slides suggested that daily COVID-19 deaths could reach 4,000 a day by December. With 10 days to go, we're still less than 15% of that figure. Now, again, I looked up that presentation, and sure enough, if you don't mind, the context for this presentation, which does predict up to 4,000 deaths, it's very clear. I've highlighted it. Big bold letters, words, England daily deaths if no changes in policy or behaviour. And at that press conference, it was announced there would be a change of policy, a second lockdown, which led, of course, to a change of behaviour. So, of course, we didn't reach these high predictions, because that was the whole point of having the second lockdown. Now, as I say, this data that the Mail refers to, it's not inaccurate what they're saying, but they're missing such vital context to it that it creates a misleading impression. So that is the third principle. Thank you. And so just to summarise again, 3 principles which we recommend for working with data ethically. First of all, be ensured of the integrity of the data and be transparent if you can't be. Secondly, present data accurately. And thirdly, put data in its proper context. Thank you for listening.